Okay. Okay, today we're going to be talking about names. Names. Names can be very personal. Did you ever have when you were younger someone like try to do a nickname on your name, and it drove you crazy? You hated it, right? Because why? Why did you hate it so much?
Because the name Sandy, I'm sorry, but I really don't like it. I don't know, they would call me Sandy, the dog from Annie, they would, so.
So you associated it with something, and that just wasn't who you are.
Right.
So it's interesting, in Judaism, names have a tremendous amount of significance. It's not only that irking feeling when someone mislabels you or calls you some kind of nickname that you hate, but names actually have very big significance. So much so that we know that when someone is very not well, when someone is ill, we add a name, and usually a name that has to do with life, or with Chaim, or Rafa'el, with healing, or something that is about longevity, something that can transfer those spiritual powers to the person. So names really have significance. We know that when a person faints, you're supposed to call them by their name because that evokes something deep within themselves. So what is it about a name that makes us feel this is something that very much connects to who we are? It's really, a name kind of represents how I represent myself to the world, right? So it represents like deep parts of myself. So when someone is calling Chana or Chana Weisberg, I feel like someone is talking about different aspects of my personality. What are they going to think about? When someone calls your name, what are they going to think about? What aspects of your personality is going to right away come to mind? What aspects of what you do is going to right away come to their mind? Because right away when you think of someone's name and you call them by their name, you picture them. When I think of Chani, right away I picture her, and I picture all the good things she does, all the many things she's doing. That's what comes to my mind when I think of her. And that's how it is with most people. When you think of a name, you call someone by their name, you think of all these things that encapsulate that person. So the book of Shemos, and the very first Parsha, the first section of Shemos, is called Shemos. So this whole book is called Shemos, which means names, and this very first Parsha is called Shemos. And why is it called Shemos? Because it starts off talking about naming, again, the children of Yaakov, the tribes, the 12 tribes, and it goes back to say how they came down to Egypt. They were all, at this point, they no longer were alive. They had all died, and it's the next generation that's taking over, but it's naming all of these tribes again from last week's Parsha, Parshas Vayechi, after they all had passed away. It's a new era. It's the second generation. It's the next generation, and yet we're starting off by renaming those individuals. And we know that what's going to happen in this Parsha is the Jewish people are going to be enslaved. They're going to be in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. And the next several Parshiot are going to be the difficulties that they went through in Egypt. And then finally they leave Egypt and they receive the Torah. But as we're starting off this new era, where God is reminding us or calling these names again, he's counting each of the different 12 tribes and he's naming them. And that's why the Parsha is called by their name. And the commentaries say, why is God calling them again? We just had it last week. Why is it repeating it again? And they're not even alive at this point. And it says God is doing just like he does with the stars. He brings them out one at a time at night. He calls them by name as they come out and as they go back in, out of his love for them. And this is why God is calling them by their name. We were introduced to them a few parshios ago. Now they've departed, so God is again naming them to count them once again and show how beloved they are to him. Now, when we think about counting and names, really it's two separate things. You can be counting something, like I could count how many of these, what are these called? Smarties? Lentils, M&Ms, whatever you want to call them. I could count how many there are in here because they're all the same. They're all M&Ms, right? They're all the same. So I count 1, 2, 3. I might like them all, and I might love them all, right? And that's why I'm counting them. Or imagine a child counting their chocolate or their candies. But I'm counting them because they're all the same. They're all exactly the same, and I like each of them equally, right? There's no difference to me. I like them all equally. A name is different than something like that where we're counting. We're just counting 1, 2, 3. Counting is the ultimate equalizer. So if I say there's 20 people in this room, there's 20 people. Everyone is counted as one. Everyone is counted as one. And everyone is equal in that way that everyone's counted as one. But when I start naming every person in this room, suddenly I'm looking not at just the equalizing factor of what everyone is, but I'm looking at the individuality of every person. I'm looking at their unique personalities, their unique qualities, the things that make them unique. So when God is counting the Shvatim at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, God is teaching us something about how each of us is important. Each of us is counted because we all have a godly soul within us, and that makes us beloved by God. But in order for us to leave Egypt, right? This is the first parsha, the first portion where we're being enslaved in Egypt. In order for us to leave Egypt, we need to have this ability to identify ourselves, our own name, to remember, number one, that we're all beloved by God, that we're all equally beloved because we all have that unique soul. But we also need to remember our unique individuality. What makes me the way that I am? What makes me the person that I am? And I think this is true in terms of any kind of struggle or challenge that we're going through, in order to emerge from a struggle that we're going through, we need to know that God loves us all, but we also need to know and to find those special qualities that only I have, those special talents, those special potential that is uniquely me, and that I get pleasure from, and that I derive satisfaction from. I need to be able to find that in order to get through the challenge, right? And that's what it says, that the Jewish people in Egypt, by counting their names, it's reminding us of something else. It's reminding us that the Jewish people in Egypt retained their names, meaning they're in this foreign culture, they're in Egypt, and they're not assimilating in the sense that they're not taking on the names of the Egyptians. They're remaining themselves. They're remaining their unique selves. They're maintaining their names. It says they didn't change their names, they didn't change their clothing, and they didn't change their language. And if we look at all these three things, this is really the way that we present ourselves to the world. How we speak is how we present our thoughts to the world. Our language, the clothes that we wear is how we project ourselves. You could want to look professional, and you'll put on a professional outfit. You can want to look sporty, and you'll put on a sporty outfit. It's the kind of image that you want others to see. And our names as well is how others perceive us. You sound a name, you say a name, and immediately you have this perception of the person, of how you think of them. So all these three things are the way that others perceive them, how others look at them. And the Jewish people in Egypt did not change it. They didn't change their language. They did not change their names. They did not change their clothing. They dressed modestly. They dressed like Jewish people. They retained their identity, who they were as Jewish people. And because of these three things, it says this was a merit for them that they left Egypt. So on the one hand, we could say, well, this was a merit for them because they didn't dress immodestly like the Egyptians. They used their own language. They kept their own names. They didn't assimilate. But on a deeper psychological level, we could say this is what helped them to retain who they were. This is what helped them to retain their identity of their unique persona of who I am. And this is what can help each and every one of us as we go through our own challenges, as we go through our mitzrayim, which means constraints, our challenges, as we go through the constraints of our lives. What helps us to emerge? By remembering, number one, that we're all loved by God, and number two, that we're all loved by God, but we need to find that unique, special name. What am I? What does my name represent? What do I enjoy? What are the things that I enjoy in life? What are the talents that I have in life? How can I use these talents to find my unique self, to find my greatest potential? And what I find interesting in this week's Torah portion is the names that are mentioned in the portion, which I want to go through a few of these names, really reveal the depths of the person and what makes them uniquely who they are and their mission and purpose in this world. And sometimes our name could be just a reflection of what we do. You might call someone the doctor because he's a doctor, or the therapist because she's a therapist. But there's a deeper level of names, and that's who we are as per person, as people. So it starts off telling us about two people which was actually like nicknames for Yocheved and Miriam, and they're called Shifra and Puah, who are the midwives. These are the two midwives who help all the Jewish women give birth. And we're told, why are they called Shifra and Puah? And it says Shifra because she would mishaferes as hayeled. She would beautify the child. She would smooth the skin and make the child look beautiful when the child was born. And Puah, which was Miriam, who was a young girl at the time, she would do poo 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 to the child to make the child stop crying. She would coo to the child to make the child stop crying. So these are two names that are very much indicative of what they did. It wasn't who they were, but it was what they did. Really, it does explain a little bit of who they are, because this was a time when they were supposed to kill all the newborns, and here they're going beyond that and trying not only to beautify them, to calm them, to pacify them, to create a positive environment for them. We're also introduced to Miriam, and Miriam's name has really a double significance. What does Miriam mean? Bitterness, right?
You know why I know that?
How do you know that?
Because that's my granddaughter's name.
That's your granddaughter's name.
Her name is Mayan Miriam. Miriam is after her, unfortunately, after her mother's mother, her grandmother. And because it's bitter, they added Mayan, which is sweet.
Sweet. Oh, interesting. Okay.
I didn't think about it. Miriam
Mar, the bitterness. But we're going to see that Miriam has really a double name. So, and this has some. I know some people have read this about Miriam, and I wrote about Miriam's two parts of her name, and I've gotten some letters from people who said, I've always related to the bitter part. Now I could relate to this other part. I feel like I'm reborn, because there's a double aspect. And that other aspect is from the word mari, which means rebel. So you can be bitter, and then you can rebel against the bitterness. Mari, from rebelling, like merid v'malchus, like someone who rebels against. So we're introduced with Miriam. Her bitterness is very obvious. I mean, why was she bitter? She was born in the most bitter time of Egypt. It was the slavery was the worst possible time period. It was horrific. And this is the time when Paro says, throw all the baby boys into the river. They were taking babies, cementing them into the walls to make sure that the Jews had the right quota. The most horrific time period of their enslavement. This is when Miriam is born. So she felt that bitterness of Egypt tremendously. But the other aspect of her is this rebellion, rebelling against the bitterness, rebelling against the status quo, rebelling against the injustice that I see all around me. And we see that the Midrash explains that Miriam did this from a very young age. When she was just a little girl, she was brought before Paro and she says, "Woe to you," she says. And Paro was so angry. This little kid is saying this to him. He's ready to kill her. And her mother, Yocheved, says, "What, are you going to take an insult from a little child?" So he felt stupid doing that, and he didn't. But you can see Miriam's conviction, like, woe to you. She knows that this was an evil man, and right away she addresses him. We see Miriam also addresses her own father, Amram, who was married to Yocheved, to her mother. It says that when Paro made the decree that all the boys should be thrown into the river and drowned, the men of the time, her father was the head of the Sanhedrin, the head of the Jewish court of law, thank you. And so he was like a very important personality. And he decided to divorce his wife, to separate from his wife Yocheved, because he felt, what's the point of being married? What's the point of being married and having children if Paro's just going to kill the children? Why should we have children and he'll just take the children and kill them? And Miriam, little Miriam, she was a little girl at the time, she went up to her father and she says, "You are worse than Paro. Paro is only decreeing on the males. You're decreeing on the males and the females, because if no one's married, you can't have any children, male or female. Paro is a wicked man, so his decree is only temporary. You're a righteous person, so your decree is much more long-standing. And Paro is decreeing only on this world, because he has no control over the world to come. So the babies that are going to be killed are going to go straight to the world to come, straight to heaven. But you're decreeing on this world and the world to come, and so how could you be doing this?" And she said to her father, she was a prophetess, she said to her father, "Mother is going to give birth to the savior of the Jewish people. And so you need to get back together again." And her father listened. And not only did he listen, but when he decided to remarry his wife, it says all the other men of the generation did the same thing. They remarried their wives. They had separated like him, and now they remarried like him. And in this way, the generations continued to be. The generations continued to, there was children that were born. And of course, Moshe was born. So you see Miriam's feeling of rebelliousness. I'm going to rebel against the status quo. I'm going to fight against this bitterness that's around me. I'm going to fight against the negativity, and I'm going to find some hope, find a glimmer of hope, and infuse the people of the generation with this hope. And we see this when Moshe was actually born. He was born, and her father, it says the room was filled with light. In fact, one of the names for Moshe was Tov. His mother called him Tov because it was so good. It was obvious that it was so good because there was everything filled with this light, the spiritual light. But a few months later, Yocheved had to take this boy and put him in the Nile River because she could no longer hide him. And so she tapped Miriam on her head, like hit her on her head and says, "Where's your prophecy now, my child? You know, you were so convinced that this is going to be the savior, and look what's happening now." This was a mother talking full of anguish. And it says Miriam stood by the river to see not if her prophecy would happen, but how it would unfold, how it was going to happen. So this was Miriam fighting against the negativity, fighting against the despair, feeling that there was always this glimmer of hope and that God was going to save the Jewish people and take them out. And we see later on, it was when the Jewish people were standing at the bank of the Yam Suf with the Egyptians behind them, and they're finally crossing over, and the Egyptians are finally drowning in the Yam Suf after the 10 plagues, and after, following them and chasing them after, and God splits the sea. The women are taking out their tambourines. Where did they have the tambourines from?
Because they took them from Egypt.
Why would they take them from Egypt?
Because maybe did Miriam foresee this or something? Is this a prophecy or something?
Well, that's what's so fascinating. We know that when the Jewish people left Egypt, they left in such a hurry. So much so, that's why we eat matzah, because they baked the bread on their shoulders, right? It couldn't be even baked. They were in such a hurry, they didn't have time for it to stay. And yet, they remembered to take tambourines. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't like just hidden in my closet, that I could just grab it. But this means that they prepared these tambourines in advance, meaning under the influence of Miriam, their leader, who encouraged them and inspired them and gave them this hope. They knew that we would be freed from Egypt. They knew that God would save them. That was so much her vision and how much she influenced them that they too felt it. They knew that this was happening. And the only thing that was of concern for them was when we are freed from Egypt, how are we going to adequately thank God for leaving Egypt? And so they prepared tambourines in order to dance and sing with the tambourines when they left Egypt. And that's why it says, and we say in our prayers every day, Az Yashir Moshe B'nai Yisrael, Moshe and the Jewish people sang. Moshe sang, the men sang, and then the women sang, and the women sang a much more comprehensive way of singing, because their singing was also accompanied with their tambourines, with their music, because this was what they knew would happen, and their faith was so strong in Egypt. Sometimes you have this visionary around you, this optimist around you, this person who just suffuses you with hope and inspiration. It's infectious. That was Miriam. We're in the darkness of Egypt. We're in the bitterness of Egypt. We're in the mar, the horrendous, horrific suffering of Egypt, but we need to see out of here. We need to see the light. We need to realize that this is going to end and there's going to be a better time period for the Jewish people. And she infused them with such hope and such optimism that God is going to save us, and such faith that God is going to save us, that the only thing that they wanted to do was to bring along their tambourines in order to make sure that they sufficiently praise God when they are finally delivered. Yes?
You know, in Hebrew, they call tambourine Tov Miriam.
Tov Miriam, exactly. This is why, exactly, because she brought out she brought those tufim, she brought out those tambourines, and this is why she brought it out. So that's what Miriam encapsulates. That's what the name Miriam means, this bitterness and this rebellion, rebelling against the bitterness. And she teaches us that when we feel the bitterness in our lives, we need to rebel against it. We need to find the hope, find that glimmer of hope, find that faith, find the positivity, find the optimism, and find that deep, deep within us, that faith that God is loving us and God is going to help us and God is going to help save us from the predicament that we're in. So that's Miriam. Another name in this week's Parsha is Moshe, of course, right? The big character Moshe, the main character. Who named Moshe Moshe?
But the name came later. Mashiti oto min hamayim.
So she's right. The name came. Who was the one that said?
Miriam.
Not Miriam, but Basya, right? Basya.
Said you drew him out of the water.
I drew him out of the water.
Yeah.
It was in the movie also.
So there's different actually opinions on whether Batya actually called him Moshe. Whether Batya was Paro's daughter. Batya was the daughter of Paro. She went down to the river in order to bathe. According to the commentary, she actually wanted to convert to Judaism. So she went down, and that's when she sees this child in a basket crying. And she reaches out her hand, and she knows she can't reach the baby because the baby's far away, but God did a miracle and extended her arm, and then she was able to bring in this child. And this is something that we learn, that sometimes you're in a situation and you say, well, I can't help anyways, I can't do anything anyways. That's not the response. Reach out your hand, do whatever you can, and God will extend your effort to make it actually happen. And that's what we learned from Batya. And that's why God himself says, I'm going to call you Batya, which is the daughter of God. She was the daughter of Paro, but she's called the daughter of God because of her actions. And so there's dispute amongst the commentaries. Did Batya actually call her Moshe? Did she call him the Egyptian version of Moshe, and then it was translated into Hebrew as Moshe, because min hamayim mishisiya, from the waters I drew him out? Or did she even know Hebrew, which according to some she did know Hebrew, and that's why she was ready to convert, and she actually called him Moshe. But I found it interesting that Moshe had actually no less than 10 different names that he was called. I'm going to tell you a couple of them, which I found very interesting, that he was called all these names, yet it's only the name that we know him as. I didn't even know most of these names. We know him as Moshe, right? After who? After Batya. Not even after what his mother called him. It says his mother called him Tov because he filled the room with such light, so she called him Tov. Good, that he was good. Another name he was called is Yared. According to this opinion, Miriam gave him this name because she went down to the Nile to see what would become of him. She went down and she was waiting there to see what's going to happen with Moshe, waiting to see what is going to happen because she knew something good was going to happen. Or it was because he brought down the Torah, Yared, which means to bring down. He brought down the Torah. Another name is Chaver, which means friend or companion or connector, because he connected the Jewish people to God. He was the one that connected them to God. So there's all these different names. Another name is Yekutiel from hope, from Kava, from hope. And this, Yocheved called him this because she had hope and trust in God that he would return Moshe to her. So there's all these different names. According to some, he was named Levi because that's the tribe that he came from. Shemaiah is another name because they predicted that God would hear his prayers. Tovia, which means goodness. All these other names. And yet the name that we know him is the name that the Egyptian daughter of Paro called him, which is Moshe. And how does this reflect Moshe? How does this reflect? We said Miriam, we said names reflect who we are. Miriam reflected her rebellion against the bitterness. How does, from the water I drew him out, how does that reflect Moshe?
He was run he was raised by Paro.
He was raised by Paro. He was raised by Paro.
Yeah, because she brought him to.
Just like Batya was raised, she was a daughter of Paro.
Yes.
And yet what did she do when she took him out of the water? She was the daughter of Paro. Her father made this terrible decree, and yet she's willing to go against her father's decree, probably risking her life, in order to save this Jewish child, right?
Did she know he was Jewish?
She knew she was Jewish because
Otherwise, why would he be in the river?
right, exactly, yeah,
He was born circumcised.
right. And then his own sister said, "I'll take him to a Jewish midwife in order to." And she brought her back to Yocheved in order to nurse him. So she was risking herself by taking this Jewish child out, but she had this compassion. She said, I have this compassion. These are the victims. She was born in a house of privilege. She was completely privileged, but yet a part of her felt she wanted to convert, according to some. She had this feeling of, I want to help those that are the underdog. I want to help the victims. This is injustice. I want to correct the injustice, even if it's going to harm me. And we see this quality Moshe himself had. How do we see that? Moshe's brought up in the house of Paro. Again, he's a person who has a lot of privilege. He goes out one day, and this gets him into trouble. He goes out one day and he sees an Egyptian killing a Jew, an Egyptian hitting a Jew. And he could have just, okay, this is the society that I live in. What could you do about it? No. Just like Batya could have said, this is the society where I live. I can't do anything about it. No, she extended her hand, and God did the rest. Moshe sees this Egyptian hitting the Jew. He also says, he stops the Egyptian. He says, what are you doing? And he kills the Egyptian from doing it. The next day, he sees two Jews hitting each other. He says, how could you be doing this? And it is that act of trying to stop injustice, feeling for the underdog, that actually cost his life. He had to run away because Paro was the incident was brought to Paro, and Moshe had to run away. So he runs away. He runs away to where he eventually meets his father-in-law Yisro and his daughters, and it's there that Yisro was actually an outcast. It says he was an outcast amongst the people there, and Moshe sees Yisro's daughters going. Zipporah. He sees she had a few daughters, and they're going to with their sheep to try to water their sheep, and the shepherds are not helping them. Not only are they not helping them, they're preventing them. He stands up for them. He says, let me do it for you. So here again, he is coming to the strange land. He's running away for his life. You kind of don't want to make yourself so much in the limelight, especially against people. You don't want to alienate people who are there, and you certainly don't want to side with the people who are the victims, to be that outcast as well. But Moshe didn't care about that. He sided with them. There's a situation that I need to help. I'm going to help. And then God says to Moshe, years later, he says, I want you to go back to Egypt and take my nation out of Egypt. Take the Jewish people out of Egypt. So here's Moshe, who had ran away from Paro for his life, and God is commanding him, go back to that very person who wants to kill you. And who should you go save? The same nation who got you into the trouble in the first place, because they were the ones that were fighting and you wanted to stop it, and they brought the matter before Paro. So go back to the nation that wanted to harm you. Go back to this dictator who wanted to kill you. Why? Because my nation is suffering there, and I want you to take them out. And Moshe was ready to do that. So the name Moshe represents siding against the injustice, siding with the victim, siding with the underdog. If this is what's right, I'm going to side with them in order to help them. And that's why that name stayed with him. That's the name that we know. The Midrash explains that Moshe was a shepherd. He was a shepherd for Yisro, and he was taking the sheep out, and one of the sheep strayed. And he went running after this little sheep who went away. And he saw that the sheep went running to the water. And he cradled the sheep, and he gave the sheep water. And he said, I'm so sorry, little sheep, that I didn't realize that this is a need that you have. And when God saw that, he said, if this is how Moshe takes care of a little sheep, this is how he's going to take care of my nation. Even the ones that are straying, the compassion that he'll have for them will be like Moshe had for that sheep. This is someone who I want to have as the leader of my nation. So Moshe's name represents this as well, this idea of compassion, even for the underdog. And the last name that I want to talk about in this week's Parsha is the name of God himself. Okay, so when God says to Moshe, he says to Moshe, I want you to go and take your Jewish people out of Egypt. Go back to Paro, go back and take my nation out. So Moshe says to God, the Jewish people are going to ask me, what is your name? And it's a little funny of an exchange between them. What do you mean, what is my name? What is God? Moshe asking God, what is your name? But what Moshe is trying to say to God is just like a name reflects who we are. The Jewish people are going to say, who is this God? What's his name? What's his character traits? What is the character trait of this God who has left us in Egypt for so many years in suffering? How could God do that? Who is this God? What is his character traits? How could he be leaving us and abandoning us for so many years? What is his name? And Moshe says, what should I answer that? I don't know how to answer suffering. How do we justify? How do we answer human suffering? It's a question that we can't even understand. The only answer that we can have for it is we don't understand it. We don't understand human suffering, why God allows the suffering. And God says, I can't reveal to you why I have suffering in this world. And the truth is, God can't reveal to us why they're suffering, because if we understood why they're suffering, then we'd be part of the problem. If we understood why they're suffering, then we would justify the suffering. We'd say, oh, they're suffering because so-and-so deserves it. It's just punishment for this, or it's in the grand scheme of things, it's meant to be. And then we wouldn't fight against it. If we justify suffering, it's like Elie Wiesel was once speaking to a group, and one of the participants in the crowd was like, well, why did God do this? Why did God do the Holocaust? And he says, I don't know. And the person was persistent and nudging. One of these, sometimes you get this really nudging from a person, on and on. And he says, if I'm going to tell you why, and justify why God did it, then I'll become a Nazi. In other words, someone who can justify why the Holocaust happened, why this injustice happened. If you can justify it, then you yourself are a Nazi, because how could you justify? How could you give a reason for it? And that's why God says, I can't reveal to you. In the grand scheme of things, God is an infinite God. God only wants our good, but we have little minds. And if we really would understand in the whole scheme of things why human suffering happens, why bad things happen to good people, and we would justify why it happens, then we would be part of the problem, because we wouldn't be fighting against it. We wouldn't do everything that we can to stop the injustice. If Batya in her mind thought, well, the reason why Moshe is being drowned is because of because of the reason and why God is doing it, and she would justify it, she would never stick out her hand to actually save him. If Moshe saw why the Jewish people were suffering in Egypt and he understood it in the grand scheme of things, way past what our mortal minds can understand, and he could justify it, then he wouldn't be there to take them out, to stop the suffering. He wouldn't be there praying to God and arguing with God and saying, God, this is an injustice, free my people. And that's what God wants us to do. So God says to Moses, I can't tell you, to Moshe, I can't tell you why, I can't explain to you why there's human suffering. You're a human being, and the human mind just can't fathom the infinite God and why God does things the way he does. But you can tell the Jewish people that my name is Ekya Asher Ekya, which means I will be what I will be. We usually don't, some people say this is an actual name of God, but the word Ehaya means I will be. I will be what I will be. That is what you should tell the Jewish people is my name. I will be what I will be is sending you there. And what does it mean, I will be what I will be? What kind of answer is this that God is saying my name is I will be? And Rashi comments that God was saying to Moshe, I will be with them in their suffering. I am with them in this suffering in Egypt, and I will be with them in all future sufferings. Meaning, God is saying to Moshe, you can't conceive why people have to suffer. This is beyond human intellect. But one thing I can tell you, you can't understand this infinite being, this infinite God, and why God does things the way he does, because we're little human beings. But one thing you should know about who I am and what my characteristics are. My name is I will be. I will be with you in your suffering. You are suffering. Don't think of me as some impersonal God in some faraway land that doesn't see the suffering. I'm with you in your suffering. You're crying, I'm crying tears with you. You're suffering, you're in pain, I feel your pain. I'm with you in your pain. I'm with you in your suffering. I'm holding your hand through the suffering, and I will help to get you out. So God was teaching us something very important, that even when we go through our suffering and the difficulties and the pain that we go through, God is holding our hand. God is wiping away our tears. We don't understand why it has to happen. That's not what the human mind can fathom. But what we can be comforted with is knowing that God isn't just in some faraway land, not caring about us, but he's like the parent who, for whatever reason, needs to teach a child a lesson or help the child grow in a certain way, and you're crying with the child. The pain is so strong. You're in such pain with them, but you know that for whatever reason, this is ultimately for their good. I remember hearing of a mother who was watching her son get chemotherapy to treat his illness, and she described it as, I'm watching it go into his arms, and I know this is like a poison. And one part of me just wants to pull it out, and I know what it's going to cause, the reaction that it's going to cause in his body. So one part wants to just pull it out, and the other hand, I know that this is life-saving. So, in that way, in a sense, we could look at God as knowing, for whatever reason, he's giving us the treatment that we need to be getting. We don't understand it, and we're not justifying it, and we cannot fathom it. But he's there holding our hand as we're getting the treatment, in pain with us. And that is what was so important for God to tell Moshe, tell the Bnei Israel, tell the Jewish people, that is my name, meaning that is my characteristic, that is who I am. I am with you in this present distress, as I will be with you in all future distresses. So in this way, we see this name of God, and there are different aspects of how God relates to us, but this is definitely a name of God in our distress, in our suffering. So we learned the name of Miriam, we learned the name of Moshe, we know the name of God. And now I want to ask you about your own names and how you relate to your own names, to your Jewish names, if you have a Jewish name, if you know your Jewish name, what your Jewish name means, and how you relate to not only your name, but we said the name is something that is your individuality, your individual character strengths, your character. How is it that your unique character traits helps you to emerge from your own personal Egypt? I think when we can, just like the Jewish people, it was through keeping their names and their clothing and their language, but specifically their names that they actually merited to get out of Egypt. It's through knowing our personal strengths, our uniqueness as people, that we too can emerge from our challenging situations and get through our own Mitzrayim, because we realize who we are, we realize our identity, and we realize we can actually name the strength and the things that are so much a part of our soul powers that can help us in our own unique journey to emerge from it.
I have a very unique story.
Okay.
I have